The room went quiet when I asked the question, not the polite kind of quiet, the kind where people stop breathing for a second. My older brother looked at me like I had spoken the wrong language. "Why would you be concerned about that?" he asked carefully. "You are not involved in those decisions." A few people at the table nodded. One of my cousins even smiled, the patient, kind people use when explaining something simple to someone who will never understand it. I did not argue. I simply watched them, because the document sitting in the folder beside my hand said something very different. And in exactly 14 days, the bank, the lawyers, and the tax office were all going to read the same thing. None of them knew that yet. For most of my life, the company felt less like a business and more like a family habit. It existed the same way the old house existed, always there, always assumed. Something built long before my generation learned how to question it. My grandfather started it nearly 50 years ago, a modest trading operation that slowly grew into a regional logistics and supply firm. Nothing glamorous, but stable, profitable. The kind of company that survives quietly while louder ones disappear. By the time I was old enough to understand what it was, the company had already become the center of our family's identity. Every gathering eventually turned into a meeting. Birthdays, weddings, even funerals. At some point, someone would mention shipments, contracts, taxes, suppliers, or expansion plans. The language of the business was simply how our family spoke to each other. My older brother handled negotiations with clients. He had the confidence people expect in someone leading conversations. My cousin managed supplier relationships. Another relative supervised regional operations. Everyone had a role that sounded important. Mine never sounded like that. I managed records, not in a formal title anyone discussed openly. It simply became my responsibility over time. Documents passed through my desk before they went anywhere else. Partnership agreements, archived correspondence, historical contracts, regulatory filings. The quiet parts of the company that nobody else had patience for. No one ever described it as important work. They usually described it as something I was well suited for. "You are very good with details," my aunt once told me, in the careful tone people use when they mean something else. I understood what she meant. Details were safe territory. Strategy was not. Family meetings happened every 2 or 3 months in the conference room above the main office warehouse. A long rectangular table filled the room, surrounded by chairs that had been there for decades. The meetings followed the same pattern every time. First came updates from operations, then financial summaries, then discussion about future plans. I always sat at the far end of the table, not because anyone assigned the seat to me. It simply became where I sat. From there, I could see everyone without needing to participate much. And that arrangement suited most of them. My brother spoke the most during those meetings. He carried himself with a certainty that made people listen. When disagreements appeared, he usually resolved them quickly. Confidence is persuasive in rooms like that. My cousin handled numbers during presentations, though he often summarized them broadly rather than explaining them in detail. No one seemed bothered by that. If someone needed an old contract or confirmation of a past decision, they would look toward me. "Can you check the archives for that?" I would nod, make a note, and retrieve the document later. The interaction rarely lasted longer than that. Over time, a quiet assumption settled around my presence. I was reliable, but not decisive. Helpful, but not strategic. Capable of maintaining order, but not capable of directing it. No one ever said those words directly. They did not need to. Tone communicates many things without explanation. I never argued against it. There are advantages to allowing people to underestimate you. At the time, though, I did not think about it that way. I simply did my work. Every morning I arrived earlier than most of the others. The warehouse downstairs would already be active, forklifts moving pallets across concrete floors while delivery trucks lined up at loading docks. Upstairs, the office area stayed quiet until mid-morning. My routine rarely changed. I reviewed incoming documents, filed completed agreements, verified compliance reports, and maintained digital archives that stretched back decades. Some of those records predated me entirely. They carried my grandfather's handwriting in the margins. Old partnership amendments typed on paper that had yellowed with time. I preserved all of it, not because anyone instructed me to, but because someone needed to. Sometimes my brother joked about my habits during family dinners. "You should see his office," he told relatives once. "Everything labeled like a museum." A few people laughed. I smiled politely. They meant it kindly, I think. But there was always a quiet implication beneath the humor. The work was necessary, just not important. And in a business driven by personality and negotiation, the person who maintained records rarely attracted attention, which was fine. Attention often creates expectations, and expectations create pressure. My absence from strategic decisions never bothered me. If anything, it simplified things. While others debated expansion plans or argued about new partnerships, I remained outside those tensions. From my desk, I watched the company grow steadily year after year. Contracts accumulated. Shipments increased. New suppliers joined the network. And with each change, another set of documents passed through my hands before disappearing into the archive. The family trusted that system completely. They trusted me to maintain it. What they never seemed to consider was how much a person might learn by quietly preserving every decision a company has ever made. But at that time, none of us believed the structure itself could become important. The business was stable. The family was united. And the records were simply history. At least, that was how everyone else seemed to see them. I never had a reason to think differently. Not yet. The first uncomfortable moment was small enough that I almost ignored it. It happened during one of our regular meetings in early spring. The same conference room, the same long table, coffee cups scattered across the surface, papers stacked in loose piles that my cousin would later collect and hand to me for filing. My brother was presenting quarterly figures that afternoon. He spoke the way he always did, confident, steady, moving quickly through the numbers while explaining how several supplier contracts had improved our margins. Most people listened without asking many questions. That was normal. The family trusted him. When the presentation ended, my cousin handed out a brief financial summary. A few pages with the most important figures highlighted. I glanced through the document out of habit. Revenue looked consistent, expenses slightly lower than the previous quarter. But one line caught my attention: administrative allocation. The number was larger than I expected, not dramatically larger, just enough to feel unfamiliar. I assumed at first that I had misremembered the previous quarter's figure. Memory is not always reliable when numbers repeat year after year, so I made a quiet note beside the page. Later that evening, after the office had mostly emptied, I opened the archived reports from the previous 2 years. Administrative allocations had remained within a narrow range for nearly 8 consecutive quarters. Until now. The new figure was almost double the usual amount. That alone did not mean anything improper had happened. Costs change. Departments expand. New projects appear. Still, I checked the documentation attached to the entry. Normally, each adjustment included a short explanation from accounting. This one did not. Only a general note referencing structural updates. I closed the file and decided not to think about it further. One number without context was not evidence of anything. The second moment came 2 weeks later. I walked into the accounting office to retrieve a compliance report that normally arrived through my department. The desk where the files were usually placed was empty. Instead, a younger employee I did not recognize was organizing folders behind the counter. When I asked about the report, she hesitated before answering. "Oh, I think those go directly to Daniel now." Daniel was my cousin. He had always worked closely with accounting, but the reports themselves still passed through the records office afterward. That had been our routine for years. I nodded slowly. "All of them?" I asked. She looked uncertain. "I think so. That's what I was told." Her answer sounded more like a memory than a policy. I thanked her and returned upstairs. Later that afternoon, I mentioned the change to my cousin casually while we stood near the hallway printer. He shrugged. "Just simplifying things," he said. "Nothing important." His tone was light, almost dismissive. The conversation ended there. Another small moment. Another explanation that did not feel entirely complete. Over the following weeks, a few more things shifted. Documents that usually appeared automatically in my inbox stopped arriving. Some were minor, internal summaries or departmental updates. Others were more unusual. One morning, I noticed that a quarterly partnership statement had been distributed without passing through my review folder. That had never happened before. The statement itself was short, only a summary page. I read it twice, then a third time. Something about the formatting looked slightly different. The numbers themselves seemed consistent, but the structure of the document had changed. Certain lines that normally appeared near the bottom had been removed. I asked my brother about it during lunch. He waved his hand dismissively. "Accounting probably just updated the template." He said it with the relaxed confidence people use when they do not intend to examine something further. I nodded and let the matter drop. Still, the pattern continued. Conversations sometimes paused when I entered certain rooms. Not abruptly, just enough to notice. A door that had been slightly open would close halfway while voices lowered inside. Once or twice, I heard my name mentioned before someone changed the subject. None of these moments were dramatic. Individually, they meant almost nothing. Families operate in complex ways, businesses even more so. Small changes happen constantly. But when small changes appear repeatedly, they begin to form a quiet rhythm, a rhythm that feels slightly out of place. By the middle of summer, I found myself paying closer attention during meetings. Not speaking more, just listening more carefully. Watching who answered which questions. Noticing which documents circulated freely and which ones did not. The company still looked stable from the outside. Contracts continued. Suppliers remained satisfied. Revenue stayed consistent. Nothing openly wrong was happening. Yet the flow of information inside the family had shifted. Subtly. Gradually. Almost carefully. At that stage, I still believed there might be a simple explanation. A restructuring. A change in responsibilities. Perhaps even an attempt to modernize procedures. But a quiet part of my mind kept returning to the same question. If the changes were truly routine, why did no one ever explain them clearly? I did not ask that question out loud. Instead, I did what I had always done. I watched. And I kept the records exactly where they had always been. Because if something inside the company was changing, the documents would eventually reflect it. They always did. The first real sign appeared somewhere no one in the family expected me to look. Outside the company. Every year I reviewed our regulatory filings before they were archived. It was a routine task that had existed long before I joined the office. Government forms, partnership disclosures, tax confirmations, documents most people considered administrative noise. They still passed through my department before final storage. Or at least, they used to. One afternoon in late summer, I noticed that our most recent partnership filing had not appeared in the internal archive. Normally, it arrived within a week after submission. This time, nothing. I assumed at first that accounting simply forgot to send it. So I logged into the public registry portal where corporate filings could be accessed by anyone willing to search carefully enough. Our company appeared in the database immediately. That was normal. What was not normal was the date attached to the most recent update. It had been submitted nearly 3 weeks earlier. I opened the document. At first glance, everything looked familiar. Company name, registration numbers, board members listed in their usual order. But halfway down the page, a section titled Partnership Allocation Structure caught my attention. The numbers beside several names had changed. Not dramatically. A fraction of a percent here. Another small adjustment there. Anyone glancing quickly might have ignored it entirely. But I had archived those percentages for years. Even minor adjustments rarely occurred without discussion during our meetings. This one had never been mentioned. I read the page again, slower this time. 2 of my cousins had gained slightly larger shares. Another relative's allocation had been reduced. The explanation field described the changes in vague language. Internal structural realignment. That phrase again. The same one attached to the unexplained administrative cost months earlier. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Perhaps the meeting discussing this had occurred while I was absent. Perhaps the numbers were part of a temporary adjustment, but if that were true, someone would have mentioned it eventually. Partnership percentages were not casual numbers. They determined voting power, dividend distribution, and long-term control of the company. Even small changes mattered. The next morning, I brought a printed copy of the filing to the office. I did not show it to anyone immediately. Instead, I compared it with our previous records. The last officially archived partnership structure in our system was nearly a year old. That meant the update had bypassed the internal archive entirely, which had never happened before. Later that week, another unusual detail surfaced. While reviewing older contracts, I noticed that several authorization signatures attached to recent amendments looked unfamiliar. Not forged, just different. The handwriting resembled my cousin Daniel's, but the spacing between letters had changed. A minor observation, perhaps. Still, the date beside one signature matched the same period when the partnership filing had been submitted. The pattern began forming slowly. A set of quiet changes moving through official documents without appearing inside the internal record system. One afternoon, I mentioned a small detail during our next meeting. Not the partnership percentages, just a missing authorization line on a minor supplier agreement. My brother looked at the document briefly before handing it back. "You worry about things that do not matter," he said. A few people at the table smiled politely. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Those are clerical adjustments," he added. "We handle strategic matters differently now." The phrase sounded rehearsed. Someone across the table chuckled softly. "Different level of thinking," another cousin said. The tone was not openly cruel, but it carried a quiet message. Administrative people should remain in administrative spaces. Strategy belonged to others. I nodded slowly and placed the paper back into my folder. The meeting continued without interruption. No one asked what I had been reviewing earlier that week. No one seemed curious about the filing that had quietly changed our ownership structure. When the meeting ended, the room emptied quickly. Papers were left scattered across the table, waiting for someone to collect them. As usual, that someone was me. I gathered the documents and carried them back to my office. Then I opened the public registry portal again. This time, I downloaded every filing submitted during the previous 18 months. Partnership updates, board adjustments, tax declarations, anything connected to the company's legal structure. The files filled nearly an entire folder on my computer. For the first time, I began reading them carefully, not as routine records, but as pieces of a story that no one had explained. And the more pages I reviewed, the clearer one detail became. The changes were not random. They followed a pattern. A quiet redistribution of authority, moving slowly through official systems, while the family meetings continued pretending nothing had changed. I did not confront anyone about it. Not yet. Instead, I started collecting copies of everything. Because patterns are difficult to deny once they are fully visible, and something about this one suggested it was only beginning. The first time I asked a direct question, the room reacted as if I had misunderstood something obvious. It happened during a late afternoon meeting in early autumn. The conversation had moved toward expansion plans. My brother was describing a possible partnership with a distribution company in another region. Everyone at the table seemed focused on the opportunity. I listened quietly, the same way I always did. When he finished explaining the proposal, there was a short pause. That was when I spoke. "Before we finalize anything," I said calmly, "should we review the recent partnership adjustments?" For a moment, no one responded. My brother looked at me with mild confusion. "What adjustments?" he asked. "The filing submitted 3 weeks ago," I replied. "The one that changed the allocation percentages." A few people exchanged quick glances. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Oh, that," he said. "It was just structural maintenance." His tone suggested the matter was trivial. "Maintenance?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "Internal balancing." I waited for him to elaborate. He did not. Instead, my brother picked up his pen and tapped it against the table. "You really should not concern yourself with those details," he said gently. The words were polite, but the meaning was clear. Someone across the table nodded. "Those adjustments happen all the time," another cousin added. "They have not happened in several years," I said quietly. That was the moment the tone of the room shifted, not aggressively, just slightly colder. Daniel leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "You spend too much time buried in paperwork," he said. A few people smiled. The implication was subtle but familiar. I was noticing things that did not matter. My brother sighed softly as if the conversation had become unnecessarily complicated. "Look," he said, "the business is evolving. Some responsibilities have moved around. It is normal." I nodded. "That would normally appear in the internal records," I said. His pen stopped tapping. "You must have missed the update." I felt the weight of several eyes settling on me. The suggestion was simple. The mistake was mine. For a moment, I considered explaining that the internal archive had not received any such update. But something in the room made the effort feel unnecessary. Instead, I closed my folder. "Perhaps," I said. The conversation moved on immediately. Distribution contracts, transport capacity, logistics timelines. The same confident discussions that had always dominated those meetings. No one returned to the topic I had raised. When the meeting ended, Daniel stopped beside my chair while the others left the room. "You are overthinking things," he said quietly. His voice was calm, almost friendly. "Your role is important," he continued, "but it is different from ours." I looked at him without speaking. He smiled patiently. "Strategy can be complicated." Then he walked away. Over the next few weeks, the pattern intensified. Documents that once passed routinely through my office disappeared entirely. Partnership summaries arrived with fewer details than before. Some meetings were scheduled without notifying me. At first, I assumed it was accidental. Then I noticed that the invitations were being sent to everyone else in the family leadership group. Everyone except me. One afternoon, I approached my brother in his office. "There was a meeting yesterday," I said. "Yes," he replied. "I was not included." He looked mildly surprised. "Oh, that must have been an oversight." But the explanation did not feel genuine. Oversights rarely happen the same way repeatedly. 2 weeks later, another document appeared in my archive folder, a supplier amendment. My name appeared at the bottom of the page beside an authorization signature, except I had never signed it. I studied the page carefully. The signature resembled mine, not exactly, but close enough that someone glancing quickly would accept it without question. I carried the document upstairs and placed it on Daniel's desk. "This approval is incorrect," I said. He examined it briefly. "No," he replied. "You signed that last month." "I did not." He tilted his head slightly. "You must have forgotten." His tone remained completely calm. That calmness made the moment heavier. "Documents do not usually forget themselves," I said. He shrugged. "You process hundreds of files every week. It happens." I stood there for a moment longer, waiting to see if he would acknowledge the problem. Instead, he slid the paper back toward me. "Do not worry about it," he said. "It has already been submitted." I left his office without arguing, because by then the pattern was impossible to ignore. The changes were deliberate, the dismissals were coordinated, and the quiet suggestion repeated in every conversation was becoming clear. If something appeared wrong, the explanation would always be the same. I had misunderstood. I had forgotten. Or I simply did not understand the level at which the others were operating. For a while, I wondered if they truly believed that. But eventually another possibility became harder to ignore. Perhaps they did not think I would ever check the systems outside the family. And perhaps they believed the internal records could be rewritten slowly enough that no one would notice. That assumption would soon become very important, because the systems they were ignoring were far less flexible than family conversations. And those systems still kept their own records. Records that could not be quietly adjusted during a meeting or explained away with a polite smile. They would simply show what had happened, exactly as it was filed. The first person who confirmed my suspicion had not worked for the company in nearly 8 years. His name was Farouk. Before retiring, he had served as our external accountant for more than 2 decades, long enough to remember the company when my grandfather was still personally reviewing every ledger. Farouk understood the original structure of the business better than anyone outside the family, which was why I drove to his office one quiet Tuesday morning. He seemed mildly surprised to see me. "Still organizing the world's paperwork?" he asked when he opened the door. His tone carried the same gentle humor many people used with me. I nodded. "Something like that." He offered tea and motioned toward a chair across his desk. The office looked almost exactly the same as it had years earlier. Tall filing cabinets, faded binders, old accounting manuals stacked neatly along the walls. After a few minutes of casual conversation, I placed several printed documents on his desk. The most recent partnership filing, 2 previous versions, and a summary of the allocation changes I had quietly mapped across the past 18 months. Farouk adjusted his glasses and began reading. The room stayed silent except for the soft sound of paper shifting between his hands. He read each page slowly. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied the documents again. "Did your family explain these changes to you?" he asked. "No. And you were not part of the decision." "No," he nodded thoughtfully. "That is unusual." I waited. He tapped the edge of the filing with his finger. These adjustments move voting weight gradually toward a smaller group, he said. That was my impression. He looked up at me. But something else here is more interesting. He turned one of the pages toward me and pointed to a section near the bottom, Share Class Designation. I had noticed the line before but never paid much attention to it. Our company used several classes of internal partnership shares. Most businesses did. Farouk traced the line with his pen. This classification is older than the others, he said. Much older. How old? Original charter. I felt a quiet shift in my attention. That was decades ago. Yes. He opened a drawer and removed an older binder. After flipping through several pages, he placed another document beside the filing I had brought. It was a copy of the original partnership charter. My grandfather's signature appeared at the bottom of the final page. Farouk pointed again. Your family seems to have adjusted the distribution percentages, he said, but they left this intact. What is it? He studied my face for a moment. You truly do not know. No, he leaned back in his chair again. That line represents a protected class of ownership. The phrase sounded heavier than the words themselves. Protected how? I asked. Control rights. I frowned slightly. Our company already has voting rights distributed across partners. Yes, he said, but this is different. He tapped the paper again. Your grandfather created a silent partner class when the company was formed. Silent partner. The term sounded strangely familiar. I had seen it referenced in older archives but never examined it closely. Farouk continued. It was a precaution, something founders sometimes do when they want to prevent hostile changes to the structure. What kind of changes? Ownership redistribution, external acquisition, internal restructuring. He paused. Anything that might fundamentally alter the company. I looked at the page again. The classification number sat quietly among the other share categories. Who holds it? I asked. Farouk turned another page in the binder, then another. When he finally stopped, he rotated the document toward me. There was only one name listed beside the silent partner designation. Mine. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. That cannot be correct, I said. Farouk gave a small shrug. It appears to be. I stared at the page. My name had been written into the charter decades earlier, long before I had any role in the company. How? Estate planning, he said. Your grandfather likely assigned it early. I thought about the archives in my office. All the documents I had handled over the years, the signatures, the amendments. None of them had removed that line. Do the others know? I asked. Farouk considered the question carefully. If they understood it, he said slowly, they would not be filing partnership changes without consulting the holder. I felt the weight of the situation settling quietly into place. For months, the family had been adjusting percentages and authority inside the company, moving control gradually toward a smaller circle, assuming those changes would eventually give them complete strategic authority. But the system they were modifying had been designed long before they began those adjustments. And that system contained a condition they clearly had not noticed. Farouk closed the binder gently. You might want to review the full charter, he said. What happens if the silent partner class is not consulted during structural changes? He met my eyes. The changes can become invalid. I folded the papers slowly. Outside the office window, the afternoon traffic moved quietly through the street, normal, unaware. Inside the folder on my lap sat the first clear piece of a truth my family had been trying to reshape for months. They believed they were quietly redistributing power, but they had overlooked something embedded in the company's foundation. And systems built into foundations rarely disappear simply because someone forgets they exist, especially when the records are still there, waiting, exactly where they were left. The first sign that something was slowing the process appeared 3 weeks later. Not inside the company. At the bank. Our family had worked with the same commercial bank for nearly 15 years. Large operational accounts, credit facilities for inventory cycles, equipment financing for warehouse expansion. Routine financial relationships. Normally, the bank processed our requests quickly. Our financial history was stable, and the company rarely created complications. That was why the delay felt unusual. One afternoon, I overheard Daniel speaking with someone on the phone in the hallway outside my office. His voice was calm at first. "Yes, we already submitted those documents." A pause. "No, that was included." Another pause. Then his tone shifted slightly. "I understand, but the restructuring has already been approved internally." Silence followed for several seconds. When he ended the call, he stood in the hallway without moving for a moment. Then he walked away. Later that day, my brother called a short meeting with several family members. I was not invited, but I heard the discussion through the partially open conference room door while I walked past with a folder. "Regulatory confirmation," someone said. "Why now?" Another voice replied. "Because the ownership structure changed," my brother answered. The door closed before I heard the rest. That evening, after most people had left the office, I logged into the corporate registry again. 2 new filings had appeared. The first was another minor redistribution of partnership percentages. The second was more significant. A preliminary disclosure document related to a potential external investment agreement. I read the filing twice, then a third time. The family was preparing to sell a substantial minority stake in the company to an outside investment group. That kind of transaction required several layers of legal verification, bank approvals, regulatory confirmation, and validation of ownership authority. In other words, systems that did not rely on family conversations. The next week, the delays multiplied. I heard my brother speaking with lawyers twice in one morning. Both conversations sounded careful, measured, not the confident tone he normally used when discussing deals. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by my office. He stood near the door, arms folded. "You have been quiet lately," he said. "I usually am." He watched me for a moment. "Big things are happening with the company," he continued. "I heard something about an investment." "Yes." He waited as if expecting a reaction. I gave none. Finally, he nodded once and left the room. 3 days later, the first official letter arrived. It came from the bank's corporate compliance department, not addressed to the entire leadership group, addressed to the company itself, but routed through the records office for internal archiving, which meant it passed across my desk. The letter was brief, polite, and very specific. It requested confirmation of authorization rights related to the silent partner class designation referenced in the original partnership charter. I read the sentence slowly. Then again. The bank had noticed it. Of course they had. Large financial institutions review foundational charters carefully before approving major structural transactions, especially when ownership percentages change. I placed the letter in a folder and said nothing. 2 days later, another message arrived, this time from the legal firm representing the potential investors. They requested clarification regarding protective governance provisions embedded in the original charter. Another careful phrase. Another system noticing something the family had overlooked. By the following week, tension inside the office had become visible, not dramatic, just noticeable. Meetings lasted longer than usual. Voices behind closed doors sounded sharper. Once I heard Daniel say, "That clause is outdated. It does not apply anymore." Someone else replied quietly, Then why is the bank asking about it? I kept working, reviewing documents, archiving correspondence, maintaining the same routines I had followed for years. But the systems outside the building had begun examining the structure much more closely than the family ever had, and systems rarely accept explanations without documentation. Another letter arrived, then another, each one requesting confirmation of authority before the investment transaction could proceed. Eventually, the lawyers scheduled a formal review meeting with all primary partners. For the first time in months, my name appeared on the meeting invitation. Not added by the family, added by the legal firm. The message was simple. All relevant partnership stakeholders must attend. When my brother saw the invitation, he came to my office later that afternoon. He closed the door behind him. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he spoke slowly. Some institutions are asking procedural questions about the charter. I nodded. That is normal during structural transactions. He studied my face. You would not happen to know why they are focused on the silent partner clause. The question hung in the air between us. Calm, careful. I looked at him the same way I had looked at thousands of documents over the years, patiently, without urgency. I maintain the archives, I said. He waited for more. I offered nothing else. After a moment, he exhaled quietly. Then he opened the door and left. The meeting with the lawyers was scheduled for the following week. By then, every system involved in the transaction had begun asking the same question. A question none of my relatives had considered when they began adjusting the ownership structure. Who exactly held the authority attached to the silent partner class? And why had that person never approved the changes they were now trying to finalize? The answer already existed. It had existed since the company was founded. It was written clearly inside the charter, stored in the archives, filed in government records, and now slowly appearing inside the systems reviewing the company's future. The family simply had not noticed it yet, but the systems had, and systems do not ignore their own rules. The meeting with the lawyers was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Monday morning. Everyone arrived early. That alone told me how seriously the family was beginning to take the situation. Normally, our meetings started slowly. People came in with coffee, exchanged small talk, and settled into their chairs without urgency. This time, the conference room was already full when I walked in. My brother sat at the center of the table beside two attorneys from the investment firm. Daniel was across from them with several documents spread in front of him. When I entered, a few heads turned briefly. No one spoke. I took the same seat I had always used at the far end of the table. The lawyers began the discussion in a calm, professional tone. They explained that the investment group was satisfied with the company's financial performance. Operational reviews had gone well. Market projections looked promising. There was only one issue preventing the final agreement from moving forward: governance verification. One of the attorneys opened a binder and turned it toward the group. Inside was a copy of the original partnership charter, the same document Farouk had shown me weeks earlier. We discovered a provision during our due diligence process, the lawyer said. A silent partner class embedded in the original ownership structure. Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. Yes, he said. That clause is historical. It has not been relevant for decades. The attorney nodded politely. Possibly. However, the clause has never been formally dissolved or amended. My brother leaned forward. That structure has no operational impact today. Unfortunately, the lawyer replied gently. According to the language in the charter, it does. The room became very quiet. The attorney turned a page and read a short section aloud. It described a governance safeguard written by the founder. a condition designed to prevent ownership restructuring without consent from the silent partner class. The wording was clear. Structural changes affecting voting distribution, external investment, or internal ownership required confirmation from the designated silent partner holder. Otherwise, the transaction could be considered invalid under the original charter. Daniel cleared his throat. That is simply an outdated precaution. The lawyer folded his hands. Perhaps. But until it is formally removed through proper amendment, it remains active. Another lawyer spoke next. The bank also flagged the clause during their review process. My brother rubbed his forehead slowly. So what exactly are you asking for? The answer came calmly. Confirmation from the silent partner. Several relatives exchanged confused glances. Daniel spoke again. And who exactly holds that designation? The attorney turned another page in the binder. Then he looked down the table. Directly at me. The records list one individual. For a moment, no one else seemed to follow his gaze. Then Daniel turned his head. So did my brother. Every person at the table looked in my direction at the same time. The silence that followed felt heavy but strangely calm. No one reacted immediately, not disbelief, not anger, just a slow recognition spreading through the room. My brother spoke first. That cannot be correct. The lawyer slid a photocopy across the table. My grandfather's signature appeared at the bottom of the page. Above it was the silent partner designation, and beside it the name assigned to that role decades earlier. Mine. Daniel read the page twice before speaking again. This must be a clerical mistake. The lawyer shook his head gently. We confirmed it through the original charter and subsequent filings. The designation has never been transferred or dissolved. My brother leaned back in his chair. The confident tone he usually carried during meetings was gone. So what does that mean in practice? He asked. It means, the lawyer said carefully, that any structural ownership changes require confirmation from the silent partner. Another long silence settled across the room. No one looked at me directly anymore. Instead, they studied the papers in front of them, calculating, reconsidering the previous months, the percentage changes, the investment negotiations. All the adjustments made quietly without involving the one role that could legally stop them. Eventually, my brother turned toward me. His voice sounded different now, quieter. Did you know about this? I considered the question for a moment. Then I answered honestly. Recently. The word lingered between us. Daniel exhaled slowly. This complicates things. The lawyer nodded. Only procedurally. If the silent partner approves the restructuring, the process can continue normally. Everyone understood the implication. The entire transaction now depended on a signature they had never expected to request. My brother looked at me again, waiting, perhaps expecting anger or confrontation. Instead, I remained quiet, because the realization forming inside me was not about control or authority. It was about something much simpler. For months, they had treated my concerns as misunderstandings, clerical confusion, evidence that I did not understand how decisions were made at their level. Now the same systems they trusted to finalize their deal were pointing toward a line in the charter they had never bothered to read carefully. A line I had archived for years without knowing its full weight. And the system was asking only one question. Would the silent partner approve what the family had already tried to do without him? I did not answer that question during the meeting, because the decision required time, not anger. Not revenge, just careful thought, the kind that rarely happens in loud rooms, and the consequences of that decision were already beginning to unfold quietly around us. After the meeting with the lawyers, the office felt different, not dramatically. No arguments happened in the hallway, no voices were raised. The warehouse downstairs continued operating the same way it always had. Trucks arrived. Shipments left. Employees moved pallets across the concrete floor without noticing that anything unusual had happened upstairs. But the silence inside the conference rooms had changed. People spoke more carefully, and they looked at me differently, not with hostility, something closer to uncertainty. The lawyers sent a formal summary 2 days later. It explained the situation in precise legal language. The silent partner clause remained valid under the original charter. Because the role had never been dissolved through a proper amendment, its authority still existed within the company's governance structure. Any restructuring that altered voting distribution or ownership percentages required written confirmation from the silent partner holder. Without it, the changes could be considered invalid. The message circulated through the family quickly. Within hours, several relatives came by my office individually. Most conversations were brief. Daniel arrived first. He closed the door behind him and sat down across the desk. "This situation is unfortunate," he said. I waited. "We were trying to position the company for future growth." His tone suggested the explanation should be enough. "I understand," I said. He watched me for a moment. "You realize the investment deal depends on your approval now." "Yes." Another pause. "We could correct the oversight easily," he continued. "A simple confirmation document." His voice was calm, but the confidence he once carried had faded slightly. "I will review everything carefully," I replied. He nodded once and stood up. "Of course." Later that afternoon, my brother came to speak with me. He remained standing near the window instead of sitting down. "The lawyers explained the situation," he said. "Yes." He folded his arms. "You could help resolve it quickly." "I could." He looked at the floor for a moment before speaking again. "You should understand something," he said quietly. "None of this was personal." I did not respond, because the past months had been built entirely on quiet assumptions about what I did or did not understand. He continued. "We thought the structural adjustments would simplify decision-making." I looked at him calmly. "And excluding me simplified it." The question was not accusatory, just factual. He hesitated. "That was not the intention." But neither of us tried to pretend the explanation changed anything. A week later, the external investors requested an update from the legal team. Their response was careful. The transaction was temporarily suspended pending governance clarification. Banks issued similar statements. Nothing dramatic, just procedural delays. The kind that slowly drain momentum from large deals. Within the family, the conversations became quieter. Some relatives avoided discussing the situation entirely. Others began reviewing documents more carefully than they ever had before. For the first time since the company had grown beyond my grandfather's original operation, the foundation of its structure was being read line by line, not interpreted casually during meetings, studied, verified, understood. 2 weeks passed before the lawyers scheduled another meeting. This one was shorter, more formal. They explained that the partnership adjustments filed earlier in the year were now under review. Because those changes had been implemented without silent partner confirmation, they might need to be reversed in order to maintain compliance with the charter. Daniel looked tired during that meeting. My brother said very little. The lawyers spoke most of the time, describing procedures, possible outcomes, necessary documentation. In the end, the explanation was simple. The company could move forward. But only after the original structure was restored and any future restructuring included proper authorization from all governing roles, including mine. No one argued with the lawyers. There was nothing to argue. The rules had existed since the company was created. They had simply been ignored. After the meeting ended, everyone left the conference room slowly. Papers were gathered. Chairs pushed back quietly. No one tried to start another discussion. The system had already spoken. And systems rarely care about family dynamics. They care about records, signatures, and rules written long before anyone at the table believed they would matter again. For the first time in months, the company's future decisions would need to follow those rules carefully. Not because someone demanded it, but because the structure itself required it. A structure my grandfather had designed decades earlier, and one the rest of the family had nearly forgotten. Until the moment it quietly reminded them that it still existed. The company did not collapse. Nothing dramatic happened after the lawyers finished their review. The investment deal simply faded away, not because anyone canceled it directly. The process just slowed until the investors eventually redirected their attention elsewhere. Deals often depend on momentum. Once delays begin appearing, momentum disappears quietly. Inside the company, the original ownership structure was restored. The partnership percentages returned to their earlier form. Several amendments were drafted to clarify governance procedures so that similar oversights would not happen again. Those documents passed through my office before they were filed, just like every other record in the company. Family gatherings continued, though they felt different now. Conversations about strategy still happened around the same conference table. My brother still led most of those discussions. Daniel still reviewed the numbers. But the rhythm had changed. Whenever a structural decision appeared in conversation, someone eventually paused and asked the same careful question. Does this require silent partner confirmation? No one asked it sarcastically. They asked it the way people ask about regulations they have learned not to ignore. Some relatives avoided speaking with me directly for a while. Others treated me with a quiet politeness that had not existed before. No apologies were offered. None were requested. The business continued operating the way it always had. Shipments moved through the warehouse. Contracts renewed. Employees arrived each morning expecting a normal workday. And most days, that is exactly what they found. I still arrived earlier than the others. I still reviewed documents before they disappeared into the archive. The office looked the same. The work felt the same. But the room was never quite the same again, because everyone now understood something they had overlooked for years. The quiet person maintaining the records had never simply been keeping history. He had been holding the structure together. And sometimes the strongest authority inside a company does not sit at the center of the table. Sometimes it sits quietly at the end of it, where no one thinks to look, until the records begin speaking for themselves.